it was almost like they were two different people, the Bobby Jones that I knew and the Bobby Jones who was that golfer. I never saw my grandfather where he wasn't either on two canes, a wheelchair, or in a bed. That's how the progression went. So I never saw him swing a club, and movies were released. And I got a chance to watch my grandfather move. And then he opened his mouth on the movies and spoke. And all of a sudden, the voice that I remembered came out of that man. The first thing that occurred to me was this person that I knew and the golfer, these are the same person. But the other thing that really struck me was when I watched his athletic performance. Oh my God, what did he lose? He went from being the Emperor Jones to being 70 pounds by the time he died.
Golf Smarter number 802. This episode of Golf Smarter is brought to you by dynamicgolfers.com/Golf Smarter. Bobby Jones' grandson, Dr. Bob Jones IV, unreluctantly being golf royalty.
This is Golf Smarter, sharing stories, tips, and insights from great golf minds to help you lower your score and raise your golf IQ. Here's your host, Fred Green.
Welcome to the Golf Smarter podcast, Dr. Bob.
Thank you so much, Fred. It's great to be with you.
I've had famous golf people on, not many, but I've had some high profile golf people before, but I've never had golf royalty before. It is truly an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for finding me.
Well, you're very welcome. As for golf royalty, I'm still not sure that you've had golf royalty. You might have had the grandson of golf royalty, but maybe not golf royalty itself. So,
Well, you tell Prince William that.
Good point. Good point.
Yeah, that's right. You have the lineage, you have the blood. You are golf royalty, my friend.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Should we tell people who it is? Sure. Let's let them guess.
We'll just let them guess.
Bob. Yeah. Well, Dr. Bob is Dr. Robert Jones, Dr. Bobby Jones IV, and
yes,
grandson of Bobby Jones. And it's truly incredible. Were you honored and blessed enough to get to meet and know your grandfather?
Yes, I was, Fred. I was 14 years old when my grandfather died, and we spent a good bit of every summer with him and my grandmother at their home in Atlanta. We lived in Massachusetts, in Western Mass, in Pittsfield, where my grandfather owned a couple of Coca-Cola bottling plants and my father ran them. And so we would go down in the summertime and we would spend a couple of weeks with Nina and Bub, as we called them. Bub.
Nina?
Nina was what we called my grandmother.
And Bub?
And Bub. Yeah, we called him Bub because at any given time there were, that's it. At any given time, there were three Bobs alive at the same time. So in order to differentiate, there was always Bub, Bob, and Bobby. And I was, of course, Bobby. And so we would spend a lot of time with them. And I mean, never, because my grandfather was an invalid, he had a very awful spinal disease called syringomyelia. I never had a lot of the typical grandfather-grandson experiences like going fishing or ball games or
golf.
Golf. Yeah. But what I did have was just time with him, which was really, really quite incredible. He was a remarkable man.
What was your time like with him? Was he a storyteller or a jokester? Was he affectionate? No. What kind of man was he with you?
He was an extremely affectionate man. Although, he did have a very dry sense of humor. But by the time I came along, I was born in 1957. And by the time I came along, he was already into the throes of this illness that he had. And it was very, very difficult. He lived with terrible chronic pain. And with the knowledge that over time he would lose the use of his arms, legs. And so, while he had a great dry sense of humor, he was not exactly a jokester. But he was a very patient man. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. When I was about 3 years old, he had a platinum ball that was about that big around that was given to him by the Metropolitan Golf Writers in honor of the 30th anniversary of the Grand Slam. It's about 8 inches in diameter, platinum. And it had 4 sterling silver flags in it that were in the location of each place where he won the Grand Slam. You know, he won all 4 majors in the same year. And those flags were connected by long metal wires that wrapped around a center post. Now, I am a clinical sports psychologist by profession. I'm not a jeweler. And so you may ask, how in the world do I know how they were constructed? Well, the way
Bob, let me interrupt you for a second. How in the world did you know how they were constructed?
Oh, thank you, Fred. I thought you'd never ask. The way I knew was I was 3 years old. My grandfather was away at work one day, and I decided to bring him a special present. And so I wrenched every one of those flags out of that ball. And when he got home, I had the flags in my hand, and I put them behind my back. And I walked into the little sleeping porch where he basically came after work every day. And he was there. My grandmother was there. My parents were there. They were all having a drink. And I walked in and I said, "Bob, I have a present for you." And he said, "Well, what is it, son?" And I took my hands out from behind my back, and these wires were just waving. And it was very obvious what this was. My grandmother turned a shade of white like you would not believe. My father got a look on his face that said I had at most seconds to live. At most. And my grandfather just looked at me and he said, "Son, that was so sweet of you to do. That was really kind." He said, "Now, in the future, before you bring me a present again, ask your grandmother first, please." And I was like, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir." And I never got in trouble for that. So, which was good.
So I'm fascinated, since you say you were 3 years old when this occurred. Was this part of family? Has this become part of family legend, and it was repeated and repeated and repeated? So you know the story, or you actually remember this?
I have a memory of it. Of course, It's really hard to say how much of it is. I mean, I have sort of a memory. I don't know how much of it has become amplified because of family lore. But yeah, so the memory is definitely, I remember the event. I don't remember how much of that event has been amplified over the years.
And where is that today? Where is
that globe?
True.
The globe is now in the Robert Tyre Jones Jr. room of the Atlanta Athletic Club, just about 14 miles south of where I'm sitting right now. So
with the flags in it.
The flags, they are now soldered into it. So, yes, there's
no 3-year-olds allowed to touch this.
And strangely enough, they won't let me anywhere near it either. So, that's right. So there you are. Yeah. Yeah.
Did your father play golf with his father?
Oh, he did. Yes. My dad was actually a very accomplished golfer. He, when we lived in Massachusetts, my father was a very, very fine regional player. His handicap at his peak was +3. And, he and my grandfather played quite a bit together, of course, until my grandfather became ill. There are some photos on the internet of my dad in his, I guess, late teens, early 20s. And Bub was always very interested in my father's career, but he wanted my dad to understand that the future for him in golf was going to be as an amateur and never as a professional. That was difficult for my dad, because I think Dad always secretly wanted to be a professional. But I think Bub was right in the sense that he recognized how difficult it is to actually become a professional golfer. I think where he was wrong was not giving my dad time to really come to that awareness on his own. But Dad played in 3 national amateurs, 1957, 1959, and also in 1964, I believe, was the last one, and that would have been in Southern Hills. And he had really worked very hard on his golf game in 59, had spent a lot of time in Atlanta flying back and forth between Massachusetts. And he and my grandfather had decided that his game was in such good shape that there was a really good chance that my dad could have made it to the quarterfinals of the United States Amateur, which that year was going to be in the Broadmoor in Colorado. And back then, if you made it to the quarters, you got an invitation to the Masters. And Dad really wanted to play in the Masters for obvious reasons. And they got everything all set, everything was going great. My grandfather had planned on flying out to the Broadmoor to see Dad play, which would have been very difficult back then because, my grandfather's spinal illness was already going on, and sitting on a propeller plane for 5 hours was not going to be easy. And finally, a couple of days before the tournament, my dad was out in Colorado, and he called up my grandfather. He said, "Well, Dad, are you going to fly out to see me play?" And Bub said, "Well, son, I don't think I'm going to be able to make the trip. It's just going to be too difficult." And Dad said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, why is that?" And he said, "Well, son, have you seen the pairings?" And Dad said, "No." And Bub said to him, he said, "Well, son, you drew Jack Nicklaus in the first round. And I just don't see what the point is in my flying out there just to watch you play 12 holes."
Oh, my.
Oh. And sure enough, that's exactly how long the match went. And I remember years later, I said to my father, I said, "Dad," I said, when did you first know you were in trouble against Jack? And he said, "Well, we got on the first tee." And he said, "I hit my tee shot out there about 255, which was, back in 1959 was a pretty good poke." And he said, "Jack stood on the first tee with 3-wood in his hand, and he hits his 3-wood. And Dad said, by the time the ball went over his ball, Jack's ball was still going up." And he said he realized if you're spotting a guy 35 yards and they're hitting a 3-wood, you're going to have trouble. You're just going to have trouble. And he said Jack was just the most amazing player that he had ever seen. And, it wasn't that many years later that Bub would even make the statement that is remembered today, where he said after Jack set the record, Jack Nicklaus plays a game with which I am unfamiliar. And Dad got a taste of that firsthand. So
that's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing. We're going to take a time out. We'll be right back. This episode of Golf Smarter is brought to you by dynamicgolfers.com. Enough of me talking about what dynamicgolfers.com has done for me, because I wanted to share a listener testimonial about the impact that Dynamic Golfers has done for David. You may have heard me talking about David with Jim Venetos on the last episode of Golf Smarter and his battle with COVID, and that he listened to Golf Smarter to help him get through 2 hospital stays. Well, David shared with me this past weekend an email that I think is fair to share with you. And here's what he says. "For the past few weeks, now that I'm back, I've been able to play once per week. And guess what? My game totally stinks right now. I blame the stink on the fact that I'm getting used to my new equipment. Not new clubs. The new equipment is Dynamic Golfers. I'm on about day 40, and I'm loose. Very loose. No pain. No swing tension. Shoulders and back feel better than ever. From that side of things, I feel great. I would never have heard of them if it wasn't for the promotion on the Golf Smarter podcast. Haven't had to take any Advil like I normally would either before or after a round. So thank you for that. I certainly hope they continue to advertise on your platform so that others can benefit from it like I do. I'm sure this stink won't last. I need a small adjustment with my newfound flexibility. As you recall from Manzoni's concept, the single pivot swing requires the left bicep to remain connected to the chest throughout the swing. Since I'm so loose, if I lose focus for even a moment, the swing really amps up and I disconnect. When I remain connected, I'm still blasting it probably 10 to 15% longer for each club. So just need a bit of adjustment to get things back. Kind of like a new set of clubs. Have to get used to them. That's an incredible update, David. So glad to hear that you're playing regularly again. So if you want to play better golf, feel loose, hit the ball 10 to 15% farther than ever before, and not have to take pain meds before or after your round, take it from David. For only $9.99 a month, Dynamic Golfers should be part of your daily routine. Go to dynamicgolfers.com/golfsmarter to get a 7-day free trial and 15% off your membership when you check out using the coupon code GolfSmarter. Again, that's dynamicgolfers.com/golfsmarter. And remember, to get the discount, enter Golf Smarter at checkout. And do it now, because I'm pretty sure that offer won't last forever. I really appreciate you letting me ask you questions about your grandfather. I'm fascinated by him, and the fact that I can ask you these questions instead of just reading about it. Was his spinal illness, was it degenerative? Was it hereditary? What was the cause or the source of how it started?
Well, he had a condition called syringomyelia.
Right.
I'm not even going to bother to spell it for you, although
I appreciate that.
The sad part is I could. That's the sad part, because I'm not familiar with it.
You're Dr. Bob, so I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, well, I can spell it only because I had to watch it close up for a long time.
I'm so sorry.
It is syringomyelia and its cousin Chiari malformation. They have a genetic component, but they can either be genetic or traumatically induced. And in the summer of 1929, my grandfather was out playing golf at Eastlake, and he was playing golf with his own dad. And as often happens in Atlanta, this kind of summertime thunderstorm came up, and they were on what was then the 12th fairway, what's now the 3rd fairway, because, they flipped the 9s at Eastlake. And this bolt of lightning hit in the 10th fairway, which was adjoining. And so everybody on the 12th fairway, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and their pals, all took off for the clubhouse. And right when they got to the clubhouse, a bolt of lightning hit the chimney. And it shattered the chimney, and a piece of the chimney tore through my grandfather's umbrella, hit him a glancing blow in the neck, and then tore his shirt off and knocked him to the ground. And he got up shortly thereafter, and everybody thought, wow, aren't we lucky? Because, God, it could have killed you, right? Well, it did. It just would take another, 42 years to do it. So probably his syringomyelia, or his syrinx, which is the technical term, started forming at that point, but it did not become really apparent until after World War II. As a result, it's still an incredibly uncommon condition. So, and in fact, we've lent the Jones name to a charitable foundation that's dedicated to finding a cure for it, because Chiari and syringomyelia affect 3 million people in the United States at any given point. Most people don't know that. Well, we want to make sure that they do know that. And if you don't mind my shameless plugging, your audience can find out more about that by going to our website, which is bobbyjonescsf.org. And it's a great charity with some really, really wonderful people. So, yeah, that's
Bobby
that's how he
Jones,
acquired the seat.
CFS.
CSF, CSF, Charlie Sierra Foxtrot. Yep.
Okay. And I will put that in today's show notes as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so people can find that.
Great.
Did you wouldn't know as a grandson, of course, but did your father say that Bub was a disciplinarian? Come on, Fred, you can say this. A disciplinarian, or was he the fun parent and mom was the hard one?
No, Bub could be a pretty hard-nosed disciplinarian.
Well, I mean, with the reaction he had to that golf tournament, it's like, that's pretty cold, pup.
It was. Well, it was and it wasn't. I mean, to a certain extent, it really simply had just to do with the fact that getting on an airplane and flying was just going to be a little much. But yeah, it does sound kind of cold, doesn't it? It does. I've always kind of thought so. But yes, he could be very firm. Very, very firm. Bub lived in the public eye. And so my father had to grow up living in that same public eye. And even in my own case, my sisters and I were always brought up remembering, especially when we're in the golf world, that we are never just there on our own, but we are always representing our family in general and our grandfather in particular. And I remember saying to my dad once, I said, but that's not fair. And he looked at me and he said, you're right. That's not fair, but it's true. And, and he's right. In my case, for a number of years, Fred, I really tried to avoid anything to do with my grandfather's name because it was so immense. I mean, look at everything that he accomplished, not just in golf, but in life. I mean, 2 degrees, one in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech, another in English literature from Harvard, going to law school at Emory University, which is no slouch school, and passing the bar on a dare after a year and a half. And I mean, starting Augusta National and the Masters tournament, starting Peachtree Golf Club. I mean, serving on the executive committee of the USGA. How do you ever hope to measure up to something like that? And it wasn't until I was well into my 50s that I realized that, this is not just a responsibility. In many ways, it's also a blessing because it gives me the opportunity to meet a lot of people. And it gives me a lot of people to tell the opportunity to tell the story of this remarkable man. And I'm the last generation that will be able to do that, the last generation that actually knew him. And so, once I realized that, it really changed my approach to how I dealt with that legacy.
How could you possibly say to me earlier that you're not royalty? Just based on everything you just said in the last 10 minutes, it's exactly what the problem with royalty. It's you carry it with you wherever you go, and you cannot unless you want to change your name. And clearly, your name is a big neon sign.
Yeah, that's true. It's probably cost me a lot in terms of my own golf game over the years.
Oh, but I want to hear about that.
Yeah,
and
it probably has, but yet, I guess in a way it kind of does. I mean, we were brought up with we were basically brought up with that same, what is the old concept of royalty? I believe it was the noblesse oblige is the old French phrase, I think. The obligations of nobility. I don't particularly think of myself as noble in any meaningful sense of the term.
Until you walk out in public.
Yes, and in that small world.
Right.
In that small world. But yeah, I do want to always remember who my grandfather was. And I'll tell you why, Fred. I was at the Masters a number of years ago. My wife and I were there, and Mimi and I think we'd been married for maybe about a year and a half at the time. We've been married 23 years now. And we were walking up the 10th fairway, and it was beastly hot, just like it often is there. And I had this meeting I had to go to, so I was out at the course wearing a blue blazer and a shirt and tie. I was just miserable. And I'm walking up the fairway, and I stop on the side of the fairway to watch a player execute a shot. And there's this old man who's standing next to me, and he looks over and he sees my badge, which says Bob Jones IV on it. And he looks at me and he says, "Excuse me." I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "I couldn't help but notice your badge. Are you related to Bobby Jones?" I said, "Yes, sir. He's my grandfather." He said, "Oh," he said, and he was wearing one of those hats, like they were these bucket hats that had all of his master's badges on it. And I think he had every master's badge ever. And he said, "I've been coming here for a few years." And I said, "Yes, I can see that." And he said, "And I just want you to know, I remember years ago, I was down by the 12th hole, and your grandfather rode up on a golf cart. Your dad was driving him around the golf course. And they came right up to us on the ropes. And he said, your grandfather stopped and he spoke to all of us, and we met him and met your dad. And he said, his health was already going sideways by that time." And he said, "And yet he was so nice and so kind." And he said, "Mr. Jones, I just wanted to tell you that story because I wanted you to know how kind your grandfather and your father were." And he said, what was really special about that is they didn't have to do that. And that really stuck with me. And, he and I chatted for a few minutes. And I remember we walked back up the hill, and I was really quiet about that, which my wife can tell you does not happen very often. But I was really quiet about that. And I thought, that's a remarkable thing. And it wasn't until later, and I don't mean this to be egotistical, but this is what it is. I don't remember that man's name. I remember him, but I do not remember his name. And he's probably no longer with us because he was already very advanced. But I know this, he remembers mine, And see, that's the thing, as I said, I hate to sound egotistical, but I always try to remember that I'm not there just on my own. I'm always representing somebody else. When we were at the Masters in my first year, I remember there were other members. My dad was a member, vice president of the club, Augusta National, actually. And I remember saying once to my dad, I had to wear long pants and a golf shirt. And I said, "But Dad, some of the other members' kids are going out wearing shorts. Why can't I do that?" And he looked at me and he said, "Son, none of the other members' kids are Robert Tyre Jones." And that stuck.
Yeah.
And it's true.
Amazing.
It could be a little oppressive, but it also,
of course,
also
especially
is
for
a
a young
blessing.
person. Yeah.
Sure. No question.
I'm sure in retrospect, as you get older, it becomes more powerful and more meaningful. I actually was at a community center having lunch with seniors. Mm-hmm. And there was a woman across the table and like, "Where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from?" And long story short, one of these women there went to high school with my mother. And she was telling me, and this is, I'm in Northern California. They went to school in Southern California. And she was telling me stories about what a funny and kind and wonderful singer my mother was. Now, I've never heard any of that because my parents passed when I was so young. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know their friends, or after they passed, I really didn't have contact with their friends. So it was so powerful for me. I can only imagine when someone comes up to you to share a story like that, what it means to you. We're going to take a time out. Yeah, we'll be right back. This week on Golf Smarter Mulligans, episode 118 is one of the shows that I'm so happy to bring back to life because it's really helpful information that I'm terribly guilty of not adhering to. We meet with Rick Piphall, who goes by Duffy McGolf on what he refers to as rare golf. That's RARE, or respect, attitude, ready golf, and etiquette. Not that I don't respect the game or avoid walking on someone's line when putting, but there are various elements of the unspoken rules that not only should be of interest to new players, but to every golfer.
The most common mistake I witness is that people continue to go through their bag, rattling clubs around, getting their ball out, looking for a tee, and not paying attention to the person teeing off. Because I think when people tee off, everyone should be watching their shot, because sometimes it's difficult to see, and people have a tendency to be focused on getting their own things together. Rattling of clubs and things like that can be very annoying and distracting to someone. Get ready as quickly as you can. Stand in a safe place so that you're not in the peripheral vision of the golfer. And also be a good partner and watch that ball as it goes off their club so that if they have trouble seeing it, you'll be a good helper in looking for the ball and finding it much more easily.
Unfortunately, Rick's website and the free ebook that we talk about are no longer available, so it is important for you to listen to this episode and get the refresher that we all could have in the back of our head. That's Duffy McGolf this week on episode 118 of Golf Smarter Mulligans, being released this Friday. Both Golf Smarter and Golf Smarter Mulligans are available from where you're listening to this podcast right now. Please subscribe and follow both so that you can get a brand new episode of either as it downloads to your favorite listening device. In an episode I did a few weeks ago with Jim Waldron, when he was interviewing me, he mentioned that a lot of people didn't know the fact that Bobby Jones suffered from severe anxiety and struggled with golf tournaments. And it was debilitating in many ways. I heard a quote in doing my research where Bobby Jones said, "I never learned anything from a match that I won." And it was deep for me because I call that experience. You don't learn things from things you do right. You learn from your mistakes, and that's called experience. And that's why resilience is such an important trait to give your children. Let them fall down. Let them learn on their own. Do you know, and again, being a sports psychologist, do you know about his anxiety and the struggles that he had?
I do. I think his anxiety, of course, was rooted in the fact, it was rooted in a couple of different things. One was he just was temperamentally a very high-strung man. That's just how he was when he came out of the chute, basically. But I think it was added to that by some tensions that existed within his own family. My grandfather was born on St. Patrick's Day of 1902, and he was very, very sick when he was born. He was a small baby. He had what now would be referred to as a condition called failure to thrive. And so he had that. But here's the part that makes that more difficult. He had a brother named William Bailey Jones. And I mentioned that my grandfather was born on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1902. William Bailey Jones was born on St. Patrick's Day of 1901, 1 year to the day prior to my grandfather. And he too was a sickly child from the moment of his birth. And he never developed. He just had terrible health, never was able to sustain any kind of a diet. And finally, in July of 1901, just a few months after he was born, he passed away. Well, by that time, my great-grandmother was already pregnant with my grandfather. And my great-grandmother, from the day that little Bailey died, for the rest of her life, she would never refer to that child by name. She would simply call him the baby that died when she would refer to him at all. And my great-grandfather never spoke of him at all. So they moved from Canton, which is about 50 miles north of Atlanta, down to Atlanta. And my great-grandfather started his law practice in Atlanta so that they could get medical care for my grandfather when he was born. So I think when you combine his temperamental, high-strung nature with that type of a family dynamic, it's kind of like pouring gasoline on a fire. And it really got in my grandfather's way as a golfer. He started playing golf when he was 6 years old, when Stuart Maiden came to be the pro at Eastlake. And he learned by watching Stuart. He played in his first big tournament in 1916 when he won the Georgia State Amateur at Capital City Club, and then went to play in his first U.S. Amateur in Marion, making it to the third round before losing to Robert Gardner. But he was always known as just this incredibly tempestuous person. And for many, many years, he would throw clubs, he would curse, he would just absolutely have trouble containing his emotion on the golf course. When he played a guy named Eben Byers in the second round of the U.S. Amateur when he was 14, he beat Byers 1-up on the 18th hole. And he said, and Byers was a notorious club thrower also. And Bub used to say that the only reason he beat Byers in that match was because Byers ran out of clubs first. Byers threw a club over the fence in one of those holes and actually told his caddy he could not go get the club. So, but it deserved to be over there. So he let it go. His temper got worse and worse until in 1922. He threw a club in the U.S. Open and it bounced off the ground and hit a lady in the leg and broke her leg open.
Ouch.
When he got back to Atlanta, there was a letter waiting for him from George Herbert Walker, who was the head of the USGA at the time, the man for whom the Walker Cup is named, and also the maternal grandfather of George H.W. Bush and the maternal great-grandfather of George W. Bush. Okay. But the letter from George Walker told my grandfather that unless and until he could learn to control his temper, his application to USGA championships would not be accepted. And Bub at that point decided he needed to put a lid on it, and he learned how to contain his emotions. He knew that in terms of temper, it's very funny. He learned a lot of things on his own that we know as sports psychologists now. He learned how to monitor his breathing, how to keep the facial muscles, especially the ones right around the mouth, how to keep those really relaxed, because that's where tension comes in. That's why you'll notice that broadcasters and singers will spend a lot of time doing facial exercises to kind of get these muscles relaxed. And so he taught himself a lot of these kinds of techniques because he knew that he couldn't really afford to lose his composure on the golf course. And that was the time at which he started winning championships. In 1923, he won the U.S. Open. And, you know, every year from 23 to 30, he held at least one U.S. championship, United States Golf Association championship in his trophy case. And he became the first man in history to win the double, which is both United States and British Open in the same year in 26. And then in 1930, the only man in history to have won the Grand Slam. In fact, when he won it, it took quite a while to figure out what it is he had done because nobody even knew what to call it. So one writer suggested impregnable quadrilateral, but that didn't exactly drip from the tongue. So, yeah. So that's why I think they settled on Grand Slam. It just sort of worked better.
That's easy. But his, so it was a temper It was not necessarily
no.
necessarily anxiety.
Well, all temper to a certain extent. All temper to a certain extent has a strong anxiety component to it.
Sure, of course.
If you think of it as a speedometer, all right, think of anxiety as a speedometer. If your speedometer is running at about 50 miles an hour, that means you've got a long way to go before you get to 100, right? But if your speedometer is running at about 90 miles an hour, you don't have a long way to go before you go into red line. And when you go into red line, that's when the clubs start flying. That's when the expletives start flying, things along those lines. And he had his speedometer ran pretty hot, and generally always did. In fact, even after he quit competitive golf, he used to say that he didn't throw clubs in competition. He said, but whenever he was at home, and as he would say, and this is a direct quote, he said, whenever I'd be at home playing with my friends and I didn't have to be on my company manners, I discovered that there were some times that just could not be endured with a golf club in my hands. So the temper was still there, even after he quit playing competitively. But I think the anxiety of competitive golf also had something to do with why he retired when he did. I mean, yes, there wasn't much more that he could do in terms of winning golf tournaments. He'd already won them all. He did not want to play as a professional. But I think also the strain that playing under that level of intensity had on him for so long just made him realize that, yeah, time to back away.
You mentioned the baby that died. Was this your great grandparents? Was that their first child? The baby that died?
It was.
And so
William
Bobby
Bailey
was
Jones.
second. William. And so Bobby was the second. Were there other siblings that followed beyond that?
No, he was it.
So he was an only child.
Oh, yes. Oh, well, yes, he was.
With a ghost. Only child with a ghost.
Only child. You couldn't have said it any better. He was the only child with a ghost. And not just a ghost, but a ghost who was never spoken of.
Yeah.
So, yeah. In fact, I was an adult. I was an adult before I even learned about William Bailey Jones.
Wow. That's is similar to my story, is that I was raised by my maternal grandparents. And I realized in my later adult years that the memories that I have of my parents are those of stories that were more than that. My father, before I was born, my father bought a movie camera and took home movies until they died when I was 7. And when I was in my late 30s or something, I took all those home movies, I digitized them, and I created a timeline and got rid of all the stuff that wasn't necessary and just put an hour long, if you want to call it a documentary, together of my family in the 50s and 60s. And it's like, here's this, so that I can show my children what our family was like when I was growing up. I can show my nieces and nephews. I have 2 siblings.
Sure.
And so I wanted to share that with them. But I realized that there were no stories. I don't remember much about my parents because they were not talked about. Right. My grandmother didn't share stories. My grandfather didn't share stories of my parents. And when I asked later on, why did nobody talk about them? And they said it's because it was so difficult for my grandparents that they just didn't want to talk about it and nobody wanted to bring it up in front of them. So yeah, you don't have memories other than these videos or these home movies.
Totally unrelated. Well, no, it's not totally unrelated to that, but I can relate to that. And I'll tell you why. I never saw my grandfather without, throughout the time I knew him, where he wasn't either on 2 canes, a wheelchair, or in a bed. That's how the progression went. So I never saw him swing a club. And it got to the point to me that the Bobby Jones that you see in the sepia images and in the portraits that are in every clubhouse in America, it was almost like they were two different people. The Bobby Jones that I knew and the Bobby Jones who was that golfer. And I remember I was about, I guess I must have been in my early 30s when where the Warner Brothers movies were released. And I remember the first time I sat down to watch that, and I got a chance to watch all of a sudden my grandfather move, right? Move. And then he opened his mouth on the movies and spoke. And all of a sudden, the voice that I remembered came out of that man.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that two things occurred to me at that point. The first thing that occurred to me was, these are the same person. This person that I knew and the golfer were the same person. But the other thing that really struck me was when I watched his athletic performance, it struck me, oh my God, wow, what did he lose? He went from being the Emperor Jones to being 70 pounds by the time he died.
Oh.
And, but the golf writer Herbert Warren Wind, I think, made the best assessment of my grandfather about all that. He said, and I think this is exact, he said, in his early years, Bobby Jones stood up with grace and dignity to just about the best that life can offer, which isn't easy. And in later years, he stood up with equal grace and dignity to just about the worst. So, yeah.
Amazing. Let's take another time out. This is highly emotional for me, but I'm really enjoying it. We'll be right back.
Me too.
This is highly emotional for me, but I'm really enjoying it. We'll be right back.
Me too. Me too, actually.
I appreciate that. That's really kind because, as you were saying earlier, you've probably been asked every question at least more than once, so you know how to answer them. So this is
but now I'm being
like
asked.
This.
Yeah, now I'm being asked a question by a man that shares some similar experiences because I was 14 when I lost my grandfather and 16 when I lost my dad. So, yeah. So yeah. I get it. Yeah. I get it.
Wow. So what do you think Bub would have thought of 21st century golf? Because you had mentioned he didn't want to play professionally.
Well, he didn't.
It's a very different beast.
Yeah. What my grandfather would have thought of 21st century golf, I think he would be a mixed bag. I mean, on the one hand, golf evolves, always has, always will. My grandfather played with a thing called the Haskell ball, which was the ball you and I would remember when we were kids. But nowadays, guys play with 2- and 3-piece balls with these artificial covers on them. When my grandfather played with the Haskell ball, there was a letter that was written to the American Golfer magazine that said, I am sick and tired of hearing about how great this Bobby Jones is. If young Tom Morris had had this modern equipment that Bobby Jones could play with, there's no telling the scores young Tom Morris would have shot. So the arguments are the same no matter what. There are a couple of tendencies in the modern game that I think my grandfather he'd accept it as this is just the reality of the thing. One of the things he would accept is that the game does change and evolve and develop over time. By that, what I would say he would think is this. As long, and he said this once, they asked him about the modern game when Palmer and Nicklaus were, and did they play the same game? And he said, yes, in some ways they certainly did, because he said, if you play 72 holes of championship golf and you shoot lower than everybody else and you don't cheat, they pretty much have to give you the trophy. They pretty much do. Shoot lower than everybody else, don't cheat, they got to give you the cup. But there are a couple of things I think in the modern game that I think would concern him. I think he would be concerned with the rise of the 7,500 and 7,600 yard golf course or longer. We're not too far away from seeing an 8,000 yard golf course. My home club, the Atlanta Athletic Club, we have two wonderful courses which can both stretch out to about 7,700 if necessary. And I think the thing my grandfather would have the problem he would have with that is that the longer you make these things, the more you remove the golf courses from the experience of the average guy and the average lady. And I think that's right. So I think the game is kind of pushing some limits there. There are a couple of other things that I think are on the horizon in the game of golf, at least on the professional or the big time level, that I think are difficult. One is, I think, and this is very controversial, but I guess since we're having a long form conversation, I'll just throw it out there. I think a lot of the things that are coming down the pike in terms of gambling in professional golf are very, very risky. And unless these things are managed in an almost superhuman way, I just can't see how we're not going to have some difficulties down the road with the introduction of gambling in the game of golf. I don't mean the $2 Nassau either.
No, I know that you don't, and I see where you're headed with that, because we think about the like the White Sox scandal of 1918,
yes,
or around there, paying the players. But the money in today's game, the prizes are one thing, but the endorsements are a completely different thing. I don't know if gambling can really go beyond that. I don't know what you can make it worth, a guy who's already earning millions, or have a $1 billion golfer who gets it from endorsements and tournament wins. So,
no, that's true.
I don't know. I mean, other than going after personal things, but now we have social media, which exposes them personally to ways that we don't want to ever see, but we're stuck with. Right. Yep. So,
you say that
conversation.
You mentioned that too. It's funny you say that about social media. That's one thing my grandfather never had to contend with, because, even while he was playing, people might see him in a photograph. But until those movies came out in the early 30s, nobody ever actually saw him swing a golf club, at least in real time, kind of thing.
Wow.
I'll give you an idea. In 1930, he had his second ticker tape parade in New York City. He's the only golfer, I think, to have had two. I know John Glenn had two. So that means to get two ticker tape parades, you have to orbit the Earth at least 3 times. Anyway, the night after the parade, my grandfather was standing on the street on the sidewalk having a cigarette, and they were sweeping up the street where the parade had been. And Bub walked up to this New York City cop, and he said, "So, officer, what's all the fuss about?" And the cop looked back at him and just said, "It's just a parade for some damn golfer." Right? Not knowing that the damn golfer was standing right there asking him the question. If Bub had been around nowadays, with social media being what it is, he couldn't have even gone out on the street without a bodyguard.
Right.
So yes, you're right. I mean, there is something about the size of the game in this day that is much, much larger than it was in my grandfather's day. And in a certain sense, that size may offer a corrective against any risk that could come from the introduction of gambling into sports. But it's something I hope somebody somewhere is really thinking out the implications of.
Right. Right. Well, it's one of the notes that I wrote down in doing my research is the branding of Bobby Jones and the Bobby Jones brand itself. And,
yes,
as BobbyJonesCSF.org, BobbyJonesLinks.com, management company, product lines. Let's
And
dig
strangely
into
enough,
that.
I do that. Actually in charge of that too. So there you go.
So that's a benefit of your royalty?
It is.
If I can bring it back, that is absolutely a benefit. And is it something that there's ever family resistance to, or is it embraced?
It's very much embraced. One of the things that we believe is this. First of all, we believe that we feel very strongly that we have a responsibility to make sure that my grandfather's legacy continues. But the modern world being what it is, and the fact that none of us are independently wealthy being what it is, we have had to come up with, how do we tell this story to the next generation? And so our philosophy is to find, first of all, product lines that make sense. Product lines that make sense in helping us to tell that story. Okay? So we have the apparel company that Bobby Jones, where you can find shirts and sportswear and all sorts of things. And if you go on their website, you will find a lot of stuff about the story of Bobby Jones. There's a whiskey company that does Bobby Jones, the Clover, the Bobby Jones whiskey collection. It's called the Clover because he used to wear a 4-leaf clover watch fob. Each leaf of the clover, the watch fob was given to him by his mother. And each leaf of the clover stood for faith, hope, love, and luck. And so, and if you go onto their website, or even if you buy their product and you look at the bottle, it tells you something about that story. When you go to the links, the website for Bobby Jones links, you will find entire page after page after page about not only the story of Bobby Jones, but how principles of Bobby Jones' life guides what they do. And the other thing that we do is we make sure that a portion of the proceeds that we receive from everything goes to Bobby Jones CSF. So we really work hard to have this, A, make sense, and B, tell the story. Tell the story. And see, if it doesn't tell the story or doesn't help tell the story, then it won't make sense. And, we have, it's very funny. Over the years, my family and I, we oftentimes do not agree on a lot. I mean, we can get pretty cantankerous, but
That's because it's called family.
That's right. But do you know, when it comes to matters concerning our grandfather, we have always been of the same mind. You talk to one of us, you've talked to all of us. And that's highly unusual. Highly unusual. So that's where we are in terms of what we do commercially. And that's my part-time job. And I am every bit as much an amateur in that as I am, as my grandfather was in playing golf. So I have no training for marketing at all. So there you go.
Well, I hope we've done your family's story justice today. It's been a tremendous honor to have you on, and I really hope that we can continue the conversation at another time, because there's so many more questions and categories to cover. But this has really been an honor for me. I really appreciate having this conversation.
Fred, it's been an honor for me as well, and I hope that we will have many more conversations too. So thank you.
I don't know about you, but that is definitely going down in the archives as one of my all-time favorite episodes. What an education, what an honor, and I was just privileged for him to be as open with us as he was. That was truly amazing. Now, just to keep my ego in check, transition. This past week, I played 2 courses that apparently are much more difficult than my weekly round at Rooster Run, and my scores reflected that difficulty, 90 and 86. So for those of you who congratulated me on my recent reports of being in control of my game, thank you. But as we heard from our high school champion, Austin, on episode 800...
But that's golf.
Follow at Golf Smarter on social media and subscribe to Golf Smarter TV on YouTube to hear our podcasts and watch unique golf videos. Golf Smarter is your podcast for caddy. And like your caddies, tips are accepted for services provided when you click on the donate button at golfsmarter.com. Now, before we close today, I wanted to say that this episode is being published on Tuesday, July 20, and I would be remiss to not mention that July 21 was Tony Manzoni's birthday. So to all of us who are touched by Tony's life and teachings, we say happy birthday, dear friend. You are missed. Not sure if you're aware, but after he passed, we created a Tony Manzoni Golf Smarter Memorial Fund in his honor to benefit the first tee of Coachella Valley. To learn more on how to contribute, please check out our full dedicated webpage to Tony at golfsmarter.com/Tony. And that's capital Tony.